Our new motto in the department is move fast and fix things, and I'm sure colleagues are absolutely sick to the back teeth of hearing me say that, but we've wasted no time in getting to work fixing our broken transport system and getting it working for the public no matter where they live across the country.
I'd love your calls on this. Is it wrong to spend £100 million to protect bats from HS2? 020 7862 double.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what have we got on the agenda today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. In our first story, we'll be looking at the controversy around HS2's bat mitigation measures, which have drawn quite a lot of coverage and headlines due to the cost and the questions about just whether these kind of measures are needed for the new high-speed railway. Later on, you have an interview with Ben Plowden, who's the chair of the Transport Planning Society, who held a conference recently about challenging car use and getting users of transport to change their behaviour, which was addressed by the new Minister for the Future of Roads. And then we'll also be examining the appearance by the Secretary of State for Transport, Louise, Haigh, at the House of Commons Transport Committee, which was her debut in front of this new committee, where many issues of interest to our listeners were covered. Christian, you've been taking a close look at the controversial bat mitigation measures by HS2. And would you like to share with our listeners what you found?
Well, yes, I've spent quite a lot of the past few days looking at this story. And just to remind people how it came about, Sir John Thompson, the chair of HS2 Limited, was giving a speech at the Railway Industry Association conference. And he wanted to kind of cite how difficult the job of building HS2 Limited was. And he gave the example of this bat shed or bat mitigation structure, which is actually in Buckinghamshire, near where the railway goes over the East-West Rail, which is being built. And he went on to explain how, although they have the parliamentary powers to build the railway, they're still required some 8,267 other permissions from various government departments, local authorities, and other organizations to get the line built. And then he went on to cite the example of this bat shed. Now, this is a place called a Sheep House Wood, and there is nearby a copse with some of these bats, which are apparently rare bats, which they needed to sort out some mitigation measures. And he seemed to be saying that he then went to Natural England and they said, well, you have to do something to mitigate them. And then they've had to spend 100 million on building this structure. Now,
the theory being, presumably, Christian, that somehow the operation of the railway will be detrimental to the bats living in the wood nearby, that either they'll collide with the trains or there'll be impact of electrified wires or drafts and so on.
Yes.
Okay.
That's the idea. But actually, when it came to it, the story was slightly different. It wasn't that suddenly they came across this wood and found, oh dear, we have to kind of mitigate it and let's go to Natural England. It was actually HS2 Limited's own ecologists back in 2016 which came across these bats and which said, well, we have to do something about it. And then HS2 drew up a list of 17 different ways of mitigating the measure, some of which were prohibitively expensive, like digging a greater embankment or building a tunnel, a fully fledged tunnel over it, or then there were various cheaper ones, like there was something about acoustic kind of deterrence. There was something about a wire mesh that would be much cheaper. But they then decided on this particular structure, which covers 4 tracks rather than 2, because Network Rail wanted to kind of ensure that maybe if there were going to be 4 tracks, because it's near the link with East West Rail at some future date, they didn't want to then have to pull it down. I think that was a mistake, but nevertheless. And so they came up with this bat shed, which is about a kilometre long, and which is built of relatively light material that is then kind of put over the tracks. And according to the documents that I've seen and confirmed by HS2's press office, the extra cost of this comes to some 115 million pounds, not 100 as was stated, most of which is about having to reinforce the groundworks, to make kind of deeper groundworks where this bat shed will be. And then some of it is then about the structure itself, right?
Okay.
And the actual total cost will be about 140 million pounds, because 145 million pounds, because that was 2019 figures.
So we have to allow for subsequent inflation, and in particular construction inflation, is what you're saying, to get to the actual costs. Okay.
But now what's weird about this story is John Thompson kept on referring to Bedfordshire County Council and saying they'd had trouble with Bedfordshire County Council, who hadn't liked what he called a rather unattractive structure, and that they had complained about it, and they also apparently were worried about some local trees and stuff. But in fact, it wasn't Bedfordshire County Council, it was Buckinghamshire County Council, and their concern was not so much with the structure, it was only really with the trees, which some trees had to be knocked down. But nevertheless, he kind of complained about this and said this also kind of caused trouble and delay and so on. But Natural England then issued an astonishing kind of press release on their blog saying, look, it wasn't us who asked for this, it was HS2 who kind of realized they had to mitigate this against damaging the bats or killing the bats or whatever. And they put up the proposals for this. It wasn't us. And we didn't approve a proposal or not. It was them who kind of analysed the various proposals and came up with it. And it was really nothing to do with us, Gov. It was all down to HS2, which kind of led to a very strange spat between what are basically 2 government organisations. And then I got hold of the story, and I got hold of some government documents or documents from HS2 Limited, which suggested that the price was actually 203 million pounds. And that's because it actually said it in a document. It said bat mitigation measures at Sheep House Wood, and it listed 4 or 5 items and totaled them at 203 million. And I was going to go and use this figure on this podcast, but then I tweeted it out. I didn't tweet out the precise figure, but I did kind of say, well, actually, we've got a story here. We've got a scoop that it's actually much more than that.
We love scoops, yeah.
We like scoops, and they attract kind of listeners. But then the HS2 press office rang me and said, no, it's not 203 million. And I said, but it says here it's 203 million. It says it in black and white. Bat mitigation costs at Sheep House Wood, 203 million. And I said, oh, no, that's the whole cost of building the line, this section of line, and is not anything to, it includes all the existing building of the line. So you have to take away £75 million and a few other pounds. It leaves £115 million and not 203. Now, I accepted that in the end after some kind of discussion about it. But I find this quite extraordinary that the accountants can put up a figure that isn't actually an accurate figure, and it's a kind of higher figure, and just lump in lots of things and say, oh, it's £203 million, when actually it's nothing of the sort. And, you know, this kind of really troubles me, that it kind of tends to indicate that, you know, any figures that come out of that, and of course this was not public figures, I'd got hold of this document, that any public figures are just, you know, back of the envelope stuff. And, you know, this is the biggest project ever built in the UK. And they seem to not be bothered about, you know, 100 million here or 200 million here, what things really cost.
What's a few hundred million between friends, I suppose.
Absolutely. I mean, it just shows a kind of, and I think Sir John Thompson's, you know, rather dismissive kind of speech at the Rail Industry Association about having to do this, and it's all a bit of a hassle. I think, you know, was the wrong tone. And then ultimately, Mark, you know, why is it costing £100 million, £140 million, you know, to build a kind of very, you know, limited structure over a small part of the railway? And what is the most ironic piece, and we'll end on this, is that this was once part of the Great Central Railway. This bit is actually part of the Great Central Railway that is being reinstated.
So it's an old railway alignment that was historically used. Alignment.
So for some 100 years or whatever, however long the Great Central survived, not quite 100 years, but there were steam trains charging through at, you know, maybe not quite as fast as HS2, but probably 75, 80 miles an hour next to this copse. And yet, you know, somehow the bat survived all the steam and hassle and everything that came about. And nobody seems to mention this. I just discovered it by mistake when I looked at Rail Map, which is a wonderful website that kind of gives you all the old railway lines that ever existed in the UK. And so, you know, surely the point I've made in my rail column is there must be better ways of doing it. Surely HS2 should have gone to Natural England at a very early stage and said, look, we've got this problem. They should have gone to ministers and said, we're risk of spending £100 million on this. Can we sort this out in some other way? You know, is there something we can do here that isn't going to cost £100 million? Can we do this in a much cheaper way? All these things, you know, and instead, because they don't have a proper budget, because there is actually, it does not have a budget, HS2. It just spends a certain amount of money and then tells ministers at the end of the year what it is. And I think, so although this story has been well covered kind of in the national press and stuff, I think, you know, we've added a bit to it here. And I think that it begs questions about the general wider aspects of the scheme, and the fact that, you know, money just seems to be no problem for it.
Christian attended a conference a few days ago held by the Transport Planning Society on reducing car use, which was being addressed by the new Minister for the Future of Roads, Lillian Greenwood MP. Afterwards, Christian caught up with the chair of the Transport Planning Society, Ben Plowden.
I've just been at the Transport Planning Society conference, which looked at the issue of how do you reduce car use across Britain. And I'm with Ben Plowden, who's the chair of the Transport Planning Society, to find out what he thinks of the speeches, which included one from Lillian Greenwood, the Minister for the Future of Roads. So Ben, how do you think it went?
So I think we've had a really interesting afternoon and evening. We had some fantastic presentations from a whole variety of speakers from different backgrounds, including an official from the Scottish Government who, as you know, have set a target to reduce car use by 2030.
Which they haven't met yet. Yes.
She admitted, and they're thinking about whether that's a sensible target and what's getting in the way of achieving that goal. I was very interested in what the Minister had to say because in terms of what I would call the framing of the issue around car use, my sense is that she used sort of language and ideas that I haven't often heard coming from a DfT minister. For example, that transport is a means to an end. It's how we get access to jobs, leisure, education, friends and family. It's a system that you have to think about as a system. We need to work back, and this was particularly interesting, from the kind of places in society that we want in terms of society, the economy, carbon, and then work back from there and say, okay, what kind of transport system do we need to give us that kind of society?
But she also mentioned health, which is something that I think Labour's been very good on.
Absolutely, and I think that the government's sort of missions-led approach, where they're looking across government departments and different policy areas, saying what's the relationship, as you say, between transport investment, health improvements, access to work, levelling up between and across communities, to use that old-fashioned phrase. Again, I think that as a transport planning society, we've said for many, many years that you have to see transport as a means of achieving access to opportunities, goods and services, and then work out the most sustainable way of providing that transport, whether you're in a city centre or in the uplands of Northumberland. And we sort of heard that message, I think, from Lillian Greenwood today. And as I say, that's not an approach to the transport agenda, all roads specifically, that I've heard often before from government ministers.
Okay, so there was a lot of discussion about reducing car use, and most of the audience was in favour of reducing car use. Not quite everybody, but there is a sense that people who in the know about transport have been saying this for years.
Yes, and actually my one takeaway, Christian, from today is the critical importance of thinking about, again to use this phrase, how you frame that intention. Because if you say, as Steve Gooding from the RIC Foundation said, I think with real sort of precision, if you frame the goal in terms of reducing something, which most people who aren't transport planning professionals don't think of as a bad thing, you're either they're not going to hear what you're saying, or they're going to reject what you're saying. So framing the intention, which is to have a decarbonised, equitable, accessible transport system that gives you access to what you need access to, is really important, so that you frame it in terms of the benefits you'd get from that kind of system, what it would allow you to continue doing, rather than saying, we as transport professionals want you to do less of this thing that you don't think is a bad thing. So, and I was talking about this to colleagues afterwards, that thinking about how we as transport planning professionals communicate literally what we think needs to happen, so that it resonates with people who aren't transport planning professionals, who own a car or would like to own a car and or use a car regularly just to meet their daily needs. I think it's really fundamental, because otherwise we're just talking to ourselves, and in the end that's not going to be enough.
But interestingly enough, you gave an award to a woman, Lindsay Anderson, who's been working for you for years. Yeah. And in her little speech afterwards, she said, well, I've been round the houses so many times and I can't face it again. And there is some truth to that, haven't we know what the messages are, and yet, time and time again, and the budget somewhat showed this, the government does not kind of meet those objectives.
Yes, and I would also say, I sort of recognise Linda's experience in that regard, but when I think about, so many years ago I was the chief executive of a very small charity originally called the Pedestrians Association, then became Living Streets.
I knew you then.
Yes, and if I think about how walking, for example, was treated in the policy debate and in terms of investment, and how it's treated now, and the sorts of investment that are going in both through city regions and through sustainable city region transport settlement and through Active Travel England, which is obviously not enough, but it's a lot more used to be. The situation is completely and utterly different. So I think it's really important to keep an eye on how far we still have to go in this respect. But we also have to look back and say, actually, the situation is genuinely different than it was when I first got into this debate 25 years ago or more. And I think we have to kind of clock and register the achievements and the change, as well as sort of feel frustrated, I guess, at how far there still is to go, particularly on carbon, where it's absolutely clear that unless we do something very significant in transport in particular, now the largest single source of carbon emissions, we are not going to meet anything like our carbon reduction targets, which are probably insufficient ambitious anyway. So I fully agree that we've got a long way to go, but I think we do also need to recognise that we have actually come further than we probably think.
I think one of the things that came out of the conference was that we need political leadership.
Yes.
And that, it has been lacking. I mean, do you see that as changing? I mean, I agree that, things are different from 20 years ago, but they're still not there.
Well, I think there's a fundamental question about where you need to see that leadership materialising. I think that the drive for devolution is a fundamental part of the process by which we will get in the right direction. So if you look at what the city mayors are saying in particular about the kind of transport system they want to support their broader social and economic and environmental goals, they're all saying roughly the same thing. We want much better buses, we want control over local rail services, we want far more spending and space allocated to active travel. We need to connect transport to the other agendas that we're trying to pursue. And I think if the government is true to its word of passing money and decision making down to the city regions in particular, and then to the local authorities through the city regions, I think that is where you will see that leadership being manifested. In London, you've seen mayors from different political parties broadly pursuing the same agenda, achieving remarkable things, I think, in terms of how the city feels and looks and operates in transportation terms. And I think you're seeing that in the other city regions as well. So I think that you certainly need the national leadership in terms of the funding envelope, the rules, the planning regime, the guidance, and then critically I think you need to see the delivery leadership being manifested at city region scale, and I think that we will see that if we keep on with that change.
Well, I mean, yes, I can take that I agree with that, but what happens if the city regions get under the sort of political control? That might happen. Say Reform UK suddenly kind of takes over city regions.
Yes, of course, and clearly, democracy has the potential to elect people whose views you might not agree with. But
I think that's happened just somewhere over the pond somewhere.
Quite important. Yes, but I think what's interesting though, Christian, is actually there's a very good book by an academic who now unfortunately has recently died, called Benjamin Barber, called Why Mayors Should Rule the World. And Benjamin Barber's hypothesis is actually if you allow mayors to make important decisions about how their regions work, it's much more difficult to be ideologically driven, because in the end, if the city doesn't work, as was the case in London before the creation of the GLA and the Mayor of London and TfL, lots of people will say, well, we can't afford this kind of ideological posturing because the bins aren't empty, the buses don't work, the streets are filthy, there's too much crime, there's too much graffiti, all those sorts of things which tell you whether the city's working or not. So I think that one of the benefits of decision making at the city region scale is that the politicians are much closer, both literally and politically, to the electorates that they serve. And if they're doing a bad job in terms of the basic quality of life for the citizens, they tend to lose office. So that it's always possible that people with very different views to that will end up in power. I think it's less difficult to be that kind of ideologically driven, I think, at the city region scale than it might be nationally.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben. So just as a last note, you're optimistic about the next 4 or 5 years?
Well, I think at this point in the political cycle, I think that certainly the policy glass is half full rather than half empty. There were some mixed messages in the budget for sure around, for example, the cost of driving versus the cost of public transport, to name but one example. But I think at this point in the political cycle, I think I want to assume that the direction is the right direction. The challenge for those of us outside government is to make sure that we kind of hold the new government to account for doing the things it says it wants to do in terms of transforming how society works, how we move around, how we get access to the things we need to get access to.
Well, thank you, Ben. That's an excellent interview. Thank you very much.
So, Christian, what were your main takeaways from the discussion with Ben Plowden?
Well, I don't want to be cynical. I think, look, we've got a new government and they're looking at this, and I think they're taking this very seriously. But, there is a bit of the déjà vu, seen it already kind of thing. And that was, as I mentioned in the interview, that was mentioned by some of the speakers, that, transport planners generally know the solutions but it's up to government to implement them. And sometimes these decisions about supporting sustainable travel and reducing car use can be unpopular. And so there's a reluctance by politicians to actually make those decisions. But you've been listening to Transport Secretary Louise Haigh, who has, amongst other things, been talking about some of these issues in a lengthy interview at the Transport Select Committee.
Yes, we're starting to get into a kind of business as usual phase of the new Parliament and the new government. So on Wednesday, the 13th of November, the newly constituted House of Commons Transport Committee interviewed the Secretary of State for Transport, the Right Honourable Louise Haigh MP, and her two permanent secretaries from the Department for Transport on the work of the DFT in a wide-ranging conversation about a whole lot of issues across the transport modes, and trying to sort of understand what the government's programme for transport over the coming years will be. Now, it was very interesting to see this sort of debut by all of the people involved, in fact, because we have a new chair of the Transport Select Committee, Ruth Cadbury, who's a Labour MP from Hounslow in West London, with a long time interest in transport and somebody who served on the Transport Committee in the previous Parliament. But then a whole lot of newly elected MPs representing the rest of the House of Commons. And interestingly, they're appointed to the committee in proportion to the representation of the parties in the main chamber of the House of Commons, which means that there's a significant Labour majority on the House of Commons Transport Committee, as there is on all the other parliamentary select committees. And as you might have expected, therefore, for a first meeting with a new Secretary of State and a new committee, it was a very polite and cordial affair. And the questions were good and well researched, but it wasn't, I would say, a particularly combative session. It was more of an exploratory. Yes. That's right. But as we know, as I say, as business as usual continues, and as we get further into the parliamentary session, and inevitably, as all governments do, this one will hit choppy waters in the transport field, as in other areas. The role of the Select Committee, regardless of party, in scrutinising and interrogating ministers and the work of Parliament will become a bit more incisive. But nevertheless, Christian, we learned quite a bit about some of the plans that the government has across the modes, and indeed some of our questions that we raised around the budget in the previous episode were also discussed.
Okay, so Secretary of State, what are your immediate priorities for the department? You want to move fast and fix things. So how are you going to achieve this while also ensuring quality of service?
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Chair, on your election, and congratulations to all the new members of the committee. Looking forward to working with you and being held robustly to account, I've no doubt. You're absolutely right, Chair. Our new motto in the department is move fast and fix things, and I'm sure colleagues are absolutely sick to the back teeth of hearing me say that, but we've wasted no time in getting to work fixing our broken transport system and getting it working for the public, no matter where they live across the country. We've already laid regulations to make it easier for local authorities to take back control of their bus services after 40 years of deregulation, and we've backed this with £1 billion of investment in local bus services through the budget and keeping bus fares capped. On our railways, we immediately got round the table and brought an end to the longest industrial dispute in the railways' history, a strike which cost the taxpayer £20 million a day in lost revenue alone. Every day the railways were on strike. And we're sorting out a number of long-standing, very localised disputes across the country, which are already starting to bear fruit, particularly on LNER and Transpennine Express, where we've seen improvements in services and a reduction in cancellations, and we'll start to see improvements in Northern thanks to the facilitation of a recent rest day working agreement. We've also fired the starting gun on reform, and the public ownership bill is merrily making its way through the House of Lords. We hope to achieve royal assent on that soon. And Shadow GBR, Shadow Great British Railways, is leading the transformation on reform, delivering integration whilst we wait for legislation to be achieved.
Christian, you've had a look at this as well, and you noted in particular some of the comments on sustainability.
Yes, I mean, there was disappointment amongst the sustainable travel lobby that there was not a huge amount in the budget for them. That they restored some cuts for Active Travel England, and it's now going to get 100 million. But there had been hopes that, given that the Labour government has been making noises about this, about how important active travel is and how, getting people to walk and cycle and use public transport means a reduction, for example, in the health budget, because it's a more healthier thing to do, and therefore fewer people will get heart attacks or become obese or whatever. So there was some disappointment, but Louise Haigh actually said that when the spending review happens next year, she's hoping for some good news in that respect. And indeed, that would fit one of the, or a couple of the kind of missions that the Labour government has about, which are essentially about, helping the health service and making people's environment kind of better places to live, better spaces, basically. So that was quite significant, wasn't it, Mark?
Yes, that's right. And I think as well on the kind of some of the more general issues we discussed in the last episode, the fact that one of the biggest ways that behaviour might have been affected in transport choices would have been to restore the cuts in fuel duty, so that the cost of motoring effectively would rise and encourage use of public and active travel. And this question was addressed directly in the committee. And as we suspected, essentially, the fuel duty was left at its present levels because of the position on the cost of living, and the fact that this would have been seen as inflationary and inflicting another burden on, in inverted commas, working people, which is part of the mantra of the government of no tax increases directly anyway onto working people. Although, as we did discuss, of course, we also saw a 4.6% increase in regulated train fares and the lifting of the cap on bus fares in England from £2 to £3 for the single fare.
Yes, at the Transport Society conference, it was notable that Lillian Greenwood, who's the new Minister for Future for Roads, as we mentioned, did say, well, we retained the bus cap. I think a 50% increase in it is not quite retaining it, but kind of, there obviously was some sort of battle over that. There was some pressure from the Treasury to abandon it, but it seems such a cheap measure to make a lot of people kind of quite happy that I can't understand why it was even increased, let alone.
But the select committee did press on this point, and they said, and one of the points that the Secretary of State made was that it is a cap and it's not a minimum. And so if you've got a fare that's kind of between £2 and £3, it doesn't mean you can now automatically bump it up to £3. That there's actually a price control mechanism in there, as if I understood what the Secretary of State said correctly, to stop the bus operators just immediately moving to the sort of £3 default fare from a £2 fare. So that was provided a bit of reassurance there.
Did Louise Haigh say anything interesting about railways and Great British Railways? And
Well, indeed, and
we've
of course,
discussed a lot.
as ever, it's so easy in a conversation on transport to go into the rabbit hole of rail, isn't it? And because rail is such a big and complicated industry, and there was a lot of discussion about rail. So now, as it happened, the select committee hearing took place the same day that the public ownership bill for the railways was completing its consideration in the House of Lords. Right. So that bill is almost ready now to be sent off to the King for royal assent. And the Secretary of State did say at the Select Committee that once royal assent has been secured, the government will then be spelling out the order in which it will be returning the franchises to public ownership. And this has been a subject of quite a lot of debate and controversy about whether the order should be in a kind of contractual order, or whether it should be in an order of kind of poor performance, with those that are considered the worst performers being kind of punished by being brought back into public ownership sooner. So that was an interesting.
That's a fascinating
revelation.
Insight, actually,
yeah,
Mark, because yes, I mean it's quite problematic, isn't it? That who you're going to take over, in what order, and how long it's going to take. I don't envy the people trying to draw that up, because there's a lot of considerations there. I mean,
there are, and they've got to try and resource the new organisation, the directly operated railways business, which is now part of shadow Great British Railways. So how all of that will be resourced and organised was also something that the select committee considered. There was a discussion around the wider reform of the rail industry.
The second act, which is the second bill.
Yes, the second bill. And we're told that there will be a consultation on this very shortly. And indeed, we were also told that Lord Hendy, the rail minister, will be appearing at the House of Commons Transport Committee himself within the next couple of weeks. So we'll be finding out more sort of directly from him on what the process for reform is going to be. But I think it was also suggested that we wouldn't see Great British Railways fully established until later into 2026.
Wow.
So we're looking at quite a long-term process now for.
I think this is something you've always said, actually, that it will take a long time to actually sort out the new structure. I remember you telling me this ages ago.
Yeah, and in fact, the committee asked the Secretary of State, to what extent the new government is picking up the work of the old government, because it had its own reform process, as we will recall, as loyal listeners will recall from earlier episodes, which was never fully implemented. And the Secretary of State, diplomatically said that they will be drawing on the lessons and experience that was gathered from that process. But it does seem pretty clear that the new government has a different view of the structure, the power relationships, and crucially the culture that will exist within the new GBR organisation. And it seems that the chair of Shadow Great British Railways has been tasked with looking at cultural change as much as anything else in creating a new organisation which is focused on customers and communities.
No great revelations.
I don't think so. I think it's more of a watch this space on that process. Yeah. There would, and as you would expect, there were discussions quite properly about the role of rail freight and the role of open access operators. And interestingly, we've discussed this before, Christian, about the sort of slight kind of ideological inconsistency, perhaps, of Labour's position on public ownership for franchise operations, and its sort of fairly laissez-faire attitude on open access. But the Secretary of State actually said, specifically on open access, she observed this is a good example of how we are basing our policy, on evidence, and we are not being ideological. We're very happy for open access to play a full role in the future of the railways. So it's being sort of worn as a bit of a badge of honour of demonstrating that this is not just an ideological project.
Right, even though, as I've often argued, there is a contradiction between kind of taking control of everything and then allowing a whole lot of open access.
Indeed, as you're wont to point out. Yeah, we also had, of course, on the very day of the select committee hearing, we had the review of the fare enforcement policy that was announced, with the Office of Rail and Road asked to carry out an independent review of ticket enforcement, as the government would have it, to stop the prosecution of people for genuine mistakes, because there have been some quite horrifying stories about this recently.
High-profile cases there have been about this, about people being charged ridiculous amounts of money, or kind of this guy who made a mistake about the fact that his rail card was not valid before 9:30, and probably underpaid by about £2.50, and was then kind of hounded. So that's a good thing. But I'm all in favour of fares enforcement, and indeed, often I've seen it as too lax, with people not checking tickets on trains or whatever. And I saw something to say that C2C, which has upped its number of kind of inspectors and kind of enforced the fares more, has brought in a much more revenue than it has cost to employ those inspectors. And I've always thought that's the case. I mean, it's the same with tax, to be honest. I mean, this reluctance to kind of pay for people to enforce means that you lose more money than you save in their wages. So let's hope that they understand that there is a balance to be had there, that, apparently the estimate I saw is that fares evasion costs the British rail network as a whole about £300 million a year. Well, that's kind of useful money that could be used to invest in the infrastructure.
Yes, and one thing passengers hate on any public transport mode is the idea that they've paid and somebody else is getting away with not paying. So I think enforcement is very important from a customer service point of view, a customer morale point of view as well.
So overall, Mark, I mean, that's an interesting run through the things that Louise Haigh said. You were quite impressed by her performance overall, I think.
I thought it was a very smooth and confident performance, and it enabled the Secretary of State also to not just deal with the kind of specifics, and there was an extensive discussion of HS2 as well, but I won't go into that again because we've
done enough HS2
at the top of the show. But there was, but it enabled the Secretary of State to get beyond the kind of usual kind of traditional kind of complaints that inevitably arise around the transport system, and talk a bit more strategically about things like the integrated transport strategy that she set out to develop.
And they have employed somebody.
Well, indeed.
Danny Williams, who's a cycling activist.
Right.
Yes, I've heard this, that he's been charged with writing an integrated transport strategy.
Well, what the Secretary of State said was that she would be setting out my overarching mission for that soon, and then we're hoping to publish the strategy in full next summer. This would be a living document, which would function as best practice guidance. And she said that, interestingly, there was a bit of discussion about, well, is there anywhere in the world where your vision is working? And Louise cited the French city of Dijon, where she said it has a remarkable integrated transport system. It's built tram lines. We don't hear a lot about those, do we, Christian? No. In less than a decade, and that is my level of ambition for every corner of England. So it'd be very interesting to see whether, as the integrated transport strategy develops, to what extent it's going to draw on international best practice, as well as the best ideas from cities, nations and regions in the UK.
Well, that's actually quite exciting point to end on. That there are some positive aspects coming out of this. So let's hope that they can be realised, and that what Ben Plowden says about the reality kind of sometimes not matching the words will not be the case for once.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, I am going to be in the Departure Lounge soon because I'm off to Japan for 10 days for a new book I'm going to be doing on high-speed rail. And the next edition of Calling All Stations will be recorded with me in Japan, talking about the amazing rail network they have there, not just the Shinkansen, the high-speed lines, which are, of course, world famous, but also the amazing suburban services and the like that is probably pretty unique, and in terms of intensity of use, undoubtedly the best in the world. But meanwhile, I was taken with this amazing story that a Glastonbury musician has taken his love for local bus service to new heights by getting the service number tattooed on his chest. This is a guy called Charlie Chamberlain, who's a DJ locally, and he so loves the 376 first bus service that runs between Bristol and Glastonbury that he's actually had tattooed on his chest the number 376 and a little picture, a little tattoo of a bus, which he's pictured kind of holding his T-shirt up to show his 376 number on his chest. And I must say that buses get a bad name on the whole. So I think this is a clever bit of PR for First Bus to kind of allow this, get this publicised, to show that actually how much bus services are important to indeed quite a substantial proportion of the population.
Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do also follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.